The world outside the rattling freight car was a canvas painted in shades of ochre and rust, baked by a sun that offered no warmth, only a relentless, bleaching glare. For 2 days, the landscape had remained stubbornly unchanged, a vast and indifferent expanse of cracked earth, skeletal shrubs, and distant, heat-shimmered mesas that seemed to float between the parched ground and the endless, pale sky. The rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on iron tracks was the only sound that mattered, a monotonous heartbeat counting down the miles to a destination that promised nothing more than the end of the line. Dust, fine as ground meal, seeped through every crack and seam of the car, coating the rough-hewn wooden floor, the stacked crates of dry goods, and the handful of passengers who had paid a cut-rate fare for the privilege of sharing space with sacks of flour and barrels of salted pork. The train itself was a beast of iron and steam, a black serpent cutting a straight line through the desolation. It was not a passenger express built for comfort or speed, but a slow, lumbering workhorse of the territories. Its primary purpose to haul the necessities of life to the isolated pockets of civilization that clung precariously to the frontier. Its whistle, when it blew, was a lonely, mournful sound that was quickly swallowed by the immense silence of the plains. Now, that whistle shrieked with a new insistence, a grating announcement that the long journey was nearing its conclusion. The train began to decelerate, its rhythmic clatter giving way to a series of groans and metallic shrieks as the brakes bit hard. Through the grimy film of the open doorway, the town of Dustwater began to resolve itself out of the shimmering haze. It was less a town than a scar upon the land, a haphazard collection of weathered, unpainted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. The main street, a wide, rutted track of pale dirt, looked as though it had been carved by the wind. A gust blew down its length now, lifting a lazy cloud of grit that swirled and danced before settling again. There was a saloon with a swinging door hanging crooked on one hinge, a general store with a faded sign, a livery stable that looked ready to collapse, and a handful of other structures whose purpose was unclear, but whose dilapidated state spoke of hard times and forgotten dreams. Dustwater. The name was an honest one. It was a place that felt perpetually thirsty, a settlement built on grit and sustained by little else. It had the look of a final destination, a place people came to not out of hope, but because they had run out of anywhere else to go. In the far corner of the freight car, shielded from the worst of the sun's glare by the shadow of the wall, sat Cole Harper. He had remained almost entirely motionless for the better part of the journey, a study in stillness that seemed to absorb the train's constant jostling without yielding to it. He was a man folded into himself, his long legs, clad in dusty, trail-worn denim, stretched out before him. His boots were scuffed and cracked, the leather worn smooth in places from countless hours in the stirrups. A low-crowned, wide-brimmed hat, stained with sweat and dirt, was pulled down to shadow his eyes, obscuring his expression from any casual observer. His frame was lean but solid, the kind of build that spoke of practical strength rather than cultivated muscle. A faded blue work shirt was stretched across his broad shoulders, and a simple leather gun belt was slung low on his hips, the worn handle of a revolver resting comfortably against his thigh. He was not a man who invited conversation. There was a quiet intensity about him, an aura of self-containment that acted as a natural repellent to the bored and the curious. But it was the scar that truly set him apart. It was a thin, white line that started just below the corner of his mouth and sliced down across his jawline, disappearing into the rough collar of his shirt. It was an old wound, long since healed, but it had pulled the skin taut, giving his mouth a permanently grim, unsmiling set on one side. It was a mark of violence, a piece of his history etched onto his face for all to see, a silent testament to a past he carried with him as surely as he carried the weapon at his side. He had not spoken a word to anyone since boarding, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape, his thoughts his own. As the train groaned its way into Dustwater, his posture did not change, but a subtle tension entered his stillness. His eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, were scanning the collection of sad buildings, taking in every detail with a practiced, assessing gaze. The final lurch of the train sent the other passengers stumbling. A trio of miners, their faces permanently grimed with coal dust and their conversation loud and coarse throughout the trip, began gathering their meager belongings. Two drifters who had been sharing a bottle of cheap whiskey staggered to their feet, blinking in the sudden, harsh light that now flooded the car from the open door. The air that drifted in was hot and carried the scent of dust, sun-baked wood, and something vaguely sour, like stale beer and desperation. It was the smell of dust water. It was into this moment of transition, the pause between the journey and the arrival, that she appeared. A young woman, little more than a girl, stepped hesitantly into the freight car from the adjoining passenger carriage. She seemed to shrink from the sudden exposure, her hand clutching a small, cloth-wrapped bundle to her chest as if it were a shield. She was perhaps 17, with a face that held the last vestiges of childhood softness, now overlaid with a weariness that did not belong there. Her dress was of a simple, homespun calico, faded from too many washings and patched at the elbow. It was clean, but like her, it looked tired and out of place in this rough setting. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was pulled back in a simple braid, but strands had escaped to cling to her temples, damp with perspiration. Her eyes, a startlingly clear blue, darted around the car, wide with an apprehension that bordered on fear. She took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance, the grimy interior, the stacked cargo, the rough-looking men who were now turning their attention towards her. The miners paused their packing, their gazes lingering on her with an unwelcome familiarity. The two drifters, emboldened by their liquor, exchanged a low chuckle and a knowing look. One of them took a half-step towards her, a greasy smile spreading across his unshaven face. The girl flinched, her knuckles turning white where she clutched her bundle. She looked like a lost lamb that had wandered into a den of wolves, her vulnerability a palpable thing in the hot, stagnant air. Her frightened eyes continued their frantic search, looking for a safe harbor, a place to anchor herself in this intimidating new world. They passed over the leering drifters, the indifferent miners, and the empty spaces on the floor before finally settling on the still, silent figure in the corner. She saw Cole Harper, saw the shadow that concealed his face, the quiet solidity of his presence, the way he seemed to be a part of the landscape itself, as rugged and unmoving as a desert rock. He was not smiling. He did not offer any sign of welcome. He simply was, and in a car full of shifting, unpredictable men, his stillness was the most reassuring thing she had ever seen. For a long moment, she hesitated by the doorway, a slender silhouette against the harsh glare from outside. The heat was pressing in, and the low, suggestive murmurs from the drifters were growing louder. She took a deep breath, a small, barely perceptible inflation of her chest, as if steeling her resolve. Then, with quiet determination, she began to walk across the rough planked floor. She did not hurry, but moved with a deliberate grace, her worn shoes making almost no sound. She kept her eyes fixed on the man in the corner, her focus so intent that the other occupants of the car seemed to fade into the periphery. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough to be heard in a low voice, but not so close as to be an intrusion. The shadow from his hat still hid his eyes, and he made no move to acknowledge her presence. He did not seem to be breathing. For a terrifying second, she thought she had made a grave mistake, that this silent man was just as dangerous as the others, only in a different, more chilling way. But she had already committed herself. Her voice, when it came, was soft and laced with a tremor she could not quite control. "Sir," she began, her voice a fragile sound in the rough-hewn space, "may I sit close?" Cole did not move. The only sound was the faint hiss of steam from the engine outside and the shuffling feet of the other men as they prepared to disembark. The girl's blue eyes were wide and pleading. I don't know anyone here," she added, the words a quiet confession of her fear and isolation. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The drifters watched, their smirks frozen on their faces, curious to see how this small drama would play out. Still, Cole remained motionless, a statue carved from shadow and dust. Just when the girl's hope was beginning to wither, just when the flush of shame began to creep up her neck, he moved. It was not a grand gesture. He simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, just once. His head dipped down and then came back up. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was permission. It was protection. A wave of relief so profound it almost made her knees buckle washed over the girl. She quickly, silently, moved to the floor a respectable distance from his outstretched boots, settling herself against the wall and drawing her small bundle into her lap. She tucked her worn skirt around her ankles and kept her eyes down, suddenly feeling an overwhelming need to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. The dynamic in the car had shifted. The silent, scarred man had, with a single nod, extended a perimeter of protection around the girl. The drifters looked from Cole to Clara and back again. The smirks on their faces faded, replaced by a sullen resentment. They knew a line had been drawn, and this was not a man whose lines they were willing to cross. Without another word, they turned and shuffled out of the car, disappearing into the blinding sunlight of dust water. The miners followed soon after, casting one last, curious glance at the unlikely pair in the corner before they too were gone. The freight car was suddenly quiet and empty, save for the two of them. The dust motes danced in the thick shafts of light pouring through the open door. Outside, the sounds of the town began to filter in, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the whinny of a horse, the faint, tinny sound of a piano. Cole Harper had not moved. He continued to stare out at the town, his face unreadable in the shadows, and beside him, the young woman named Clara sat in the silent safety he had offered, clutching her small bundle and waiting for whatever was to come next. For a long time, they sat in the shared silence of the empty freight car. The world outside baked in the late afternoon sun, and the heat radiated from the iron walls, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Cole Harper did not seem to notice. He remained a figure of immense patience, his gaze fixed on the dusty street beyond the doorway. Clara, however, felt every passing second like a grain of sand under her skin. She was acutely aware of the man beside her, of the sheer, quiet force of his presence. He was a closed book, written in a language she could not read, and that uncertainty was a source of both comfort and terror. Finally, with a movement so fluid it seemed effortless, Cole rose to his feet. He did not look at her. He simply unfolded his long frame, adjusted the hat on his head, and stepped towards the open door, his worn boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. For a heart-stopping moment, Clara was certain he would simply walk away and leave her there. The thought sent a jolt of pure panic through her. To be left alone in this forsaken place, a target for men like the ones on the train, was a fate she could not bear to imagine. Her entire future had, in the space of an hour, become tethered to this silent, scarred stranger. He paused at the edge of the car, his silhouette framed against the blinding glare of the afternoon. He glanced back, not at her face, but at her general vicinity. A quick, questioning look. It was not an invitation, but neither was it a dismissal. It was a simple acknowledgement that she was there, taking it as the only encouragement she was likely to get. Clara scrambled to her feet. Clutching her cloth bundle so tightly her fingers ached, she hurried after him, her steps clumsy in her haste. Stepping down from the train onto the baked earth of dust water was like stepping into an oven. The heat rose from the ground in visible waves, and the dust, stirred by their movement, immediately coated her shoes and the hem of her dress. The town looked even more desolate up close. A few listless figures watched them from the shaded porch of the general store, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. The sound of a badly played piano drifted from the saloon, a tinny, joyless tune that seemed to mock the oppressive silence of the street. Every window seemed like a vacant eye, every shadowed alley a potential threat. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. The vast, empty plain stretched out in every direction, making the small cluster of buildings feel like a raft adrift on a dusty sea. Cole paid the town no mind. His gaze was practical, sweeping over the layout of the place with the cool assessment of a man accustomed to sizing up new territory. He did not head towards the saloon, nor the building that passed for a hotel. Instead, he turned his back on the main street and walked towards the edge of town, his stride long and unhurried. Clara followed a few paces behind him, her head down, trying to make herself invisible. She could feel the stares of the townspeople on her back, and she imagined their crude speculations. They passed the livery stable, the air thick with the smell of hay and manure, and continued on until the last of the ramshackle buildings gave way to open scrubland dotted with sagebrush and hardy, thorny bushes. Here, nestled in a shallow depression that offered some small protection from the wind, were the remains of an old corral, its fence posts leaning at drunken angles, the wood silvered and split by years of sun and neglect. It was here that Cole stopped. He dropped a small bedroll he'd been carrying onto the ground without ceremony, and then began to scan the immediate area, his eyes searching for firewood. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the western sky in brilliant, brutal strokes of orange and purple. The heat of the day started to recede, replaced by a creeping coolness that hinted at how cold the desert night would be. Clara stood uncertainly, feeling useless and out of place. This was a world of hard, practical skills she did not possess. She watched as Cole worked. He moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. He gathered dry, dead branches of sagebrush and greasewood, breaking them over his knee with a sharp crack. He cleared a small patch of ground down to the bare dirt, ringing it with a circle of stones. Then, taking a small piece of flint and steel from a pouch on his belt, he struck a spark into a piece of dried cotton tinder. He nurtured the tiny ember with a patience she could not fathom, shielding it from the breeze with his cupped hands, blowing on it with a gentle, steady breath until a small, fragile flame flickered to life. He fed it tiny twigs, then larger ones, until a proper fire was crackling in the stone ring. The flames pushed back the gathering twilight, creating a small, intimate circle of warmth and light in the immense, encroaching darkness. The smoke that rose was fragrant, the clean, sharp scent of burning sage filling the air. Cole settled back on his heels, his work done. He seemed to blend into the shadows beyond the firelight, only the harsh planes of his face and the glint of his eyes visible when he turned his head. He had still not spoken a single word to her. He offered her neither food nor drink, but simply accepted her presence as he might accept the presence of a stray dog that had followed him home. For her part, Clara was grateful for the fire. As the last of the sun's warmth vanished from the land, the desert chill set in quickly, and she found herself shivering, though it was not entirely from the cold. She sat on the opposite side of the fire from him, pulling her thin dress tighter around her knees. The firelight danced across the space between them, casting long, flickering shadows. In its golden glow, she could see him more clearly now. The scar on his chin was a pale, stark line against his sun-darkened skin. She noticed the way his hands rested on his knees, calloused and capable. His stillness was not empty. It was watchful. He was listening to the sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the mournful howl of a distant coyote, the faint, jarring laughter that occasionally erupted from the saloon back in town. He had shrugged off the light canvas coat he wore, laying it beside his bedroll. She found her eyes drawn to it. The fabric was worn and stained, a map of long miles and hard living. As the breeze shifted, it carried the scent of the coat across the fire to her. It smelled of dust and leather and wood smoke. But underneath it all was another smell, faint but unmistakable. It was a sharp, metallic tang. The old, cold smell of gunpowder and cleaning oil. It was the smell of the gun that rested on his hip. It was the smell of violence, of a life lived on the edge. And yet, strangely, it did not frighten her as much as she thought it would. It was a part of him, just like the scar and the silence. It was a part of the protection he represented. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. It was a canvas onto which she projected all her fears. She thought of the long journey that had brought her here, the reasons she had fled, and the terrifying uncertainty of what she would do tomorrow. She had arrived in this harsh, unforgiving place with nothing but the clothes on her back, the small bundle in her lap, and a story she wasn't sure she could make anyone believe. Her desperation felt like a physical weight in her chest. She had to do something, say something, to solidify this fragile, unspoken alliance. She had to give him a reason to keep her around, to not abandon her to the wolves of dustwater in the morning. She looked at him across the crackling flames. His face was a mask of shadow and light, his expression unreadable. She needed to offer him something, some truth that would define her in his eyes, that would mark her as someone worth protecting. She chose the only thing of value she believed she had left. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a raw whisper, nearly lost in the crackle of the fire. "I'm a virgin." The words fell into the vast desert night, stark and fragile. She said them not as a seduction, but as a plea. It was a declaration of innocence, a statement meant to convey her utter vulnerability, to separate herself from the kind of woman who might willingly come to a place like Dustwater. She kept her eyes fixed on him, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting for his reaction. Cole's head came up slowly. The firelight carved his face into sharp relief. He looked at her, and his eyes, for the first time, seemed to truly see her. But the gaze was not what she had expected. There was no flicker of interest, no hint of pity, none of the base appraisal she had seen in the eyes of other men. His look was unnervingly direct, clear, and analytical. He was not a man looking at a woman. He was a man looking at a piece on a chessboard, evaluating its position, its potential moves, its truthfulness. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment, and she felt as though he were peeling back the layers of her fear and desperation to see the raw, calculating motive beneath. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first time she had heard it. "Then why are you here?" The question was a blade, sharp and direct, cutting straight through her carefully constructed offering. It dismissed her statement as irrelevant. It demanded a real answer, a reason, a purpose. It told her that her perceived innocence was not a currency he was interested in. He dealt in the harsh logic of survival, and her presence in this place, at this time, did not add up. Clara opened her mouth to answer, to spin the tale she had prepared, but the words caught in her throat. Under that unwavering, questioning gaze, the lie felt flimsy and foolish. The truth was too dangerous to tell, and a fabrication seemed impossible to sustain. The chasm between the girl she was pretending to be and the desperate reality of her situation was suddenly too wide to cross. She could not answer him. She simply stared back, her one offered truth rendered meaningless by his one simple question. The fire popped and hissed between them, and the cold desert wind swept through the ruined corral, carrying with it the scent of sage and the weight of her damning silence. The silence of the previous night stretched into the morning, thin and brittle in the cold dawn air. Clara had barely slept, her body curled into a tight ball for warmth, her mind replaying his sharp question over and over. She had offered him what she thought was a truth, and he had returned it with a question that exposed the great, gaping lie of her presence here. When the first pale light of day washed the color back into the desolate landscape, Cole was already awake, standing and stretching the stiffness from his limbs. He moved with a quiet purpose, kicking dirt over the dying embers of the fire and gathering his meager belonging in. He did not look at her or acknowledge her in any way. Clara watched him through her eyelashes, her body tense with uncertainty. She expected him to simply walk away, to melt back into the wilderness from which he seemed to have emerged, leaving her to her fate. But he didn't. After securing his bedroll, he turned and looked towards the bleak outline of Dustwater, then shifted his gaze to a low, rugged hill to the south, a brutal landscape bristling with the tall, silent shapes of saguaro cacti, their arms raised to the sky like supplicants in a forgotten religion. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible jerk of his head in that direction. It was a command, not an invitation. With aching muscles and a hollow feeling in her stomach, Clara got to her feet, clutching her bundle. She followed him. They did not walk through the town, but skirted its edges, their passing marked only by the barking of a stray dog and the curious glance of an early-rising stable hand. The ground was hard and rocky, studded with prickly pear and sharp stones that threatened to tear at the thin soles of her shoes. Cole moved over it with an easy, ground-covering stride, never once looking back to see if she was keeping up. The climb towards the cactus hill was gentle but persistent, and by the time they reached its base, Clara was breathing heavily, the thin air burning in her lungs. There, tucked into a fold of the land and half hidden by a cluster of smoke trees, was a small, dilapidated cabin. It was a simple, one-room structure made of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud that had long since dried and crumbled. The roof sagged in the middle, and the single window was a dark, empty square, its glass shattered long ago. A stone chimney stood crookedly at one end, looking as though a strong wind could topple it. It was a place of profound neglect, a forgotten relic of some long-dead prospector's failed dream. Cole stopped at the broken porch, its planks warped and bleached by the sun. He dropped her small bundle onto it. Then he turned and walked away without a word. Clara stood alone, watching his back until he disappeared behind a rocky outcropping. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the spines of the cacti. This, then, was to be her home, a shelter, but not a sanctuary. She stepped cautiously onto the porch, which groaned in protest under her slight weight. The cabin's wooden door hung open on a single leather hinge, peering inside. She saw a room filled with shadows and the thick, musty smell of abandonment. The days that followed fell into a pattern of silent, grueling work. The cabin's interior was thick with the dust of years. Cobwebs, heavy and gray, draped every corner. A crude wooden table and a single chair stood in the center of the room, both covered in a fine layer of silt. A simple cot frame with a rotted canvas mattress lay against one wall. Clara's first task was to wage war on the dirt. She found a tattered broom in a corner and began to sweep, the dust rising in choking clouds that billowed out the door and the empty window frame. She used her own worn shawl to wipe down the table and chair, her movements methodical and relentless. She dragged the ruined mattress outside, leaving it under the harsh sun in a futile attempt to bake away the smell of decay. Her life narrowed to the four walls of that cabin. Her world became a universe of dust, splinters, and the scent of old, dry wood. The work was exhausting, but it was a blessing. It filled the long, empty hours and kept the fear at bay. True to a silent promise she hadn't known he'd made, Cole provided for her. Every morning, just as the sun's first rays touched the top of the cactus hill, she would find a small parcel on the porch railing. It was always the same, a loaf of dense, dark bread and a canteen of fresh water. He was a ghost, a provider she never saw. She would wake sometimes, thinking she heard a footstep, and would rush to the door only to see his distant figure already receding back towards the town. He never lingered. He never waited for thanks. The provisions were a transaction, a fulfillment of a duty he had, for his own inscrutable reasons, taken upon himself. He was keeping her alive, but nothing more. She tried to bridge the chasm of silence between them. One afternoon, while mending a tear in her own dress, she found a small, discarded piece of canvas. Using a needle and thread from her bundle, she painstakingly patched the broken seat of the cabin's lone chair, her stitches small and neat. She hoped he might see it, might recognize the small effort to impose order, to make this derelict place a little more human. But he never came inside. Another time, she saved half her water ration, leaving the full canteen for him on the porch next to the empty one, a silent offering. When she woke the next morning, the canteen was full again, her offering untouched. Her most daring attempt came after a week of this silent routine. She woke earlier than usual, a knot of anxiety in her stomach, and sat just inside the doorway, waiting in the pre-dawn gloom. She saw his familiar, lean shape approaching in the half-light. As he placed the bread and water on the railing, she spoke, her voice rusty from disuse. "Thank you." The words were small, barely audible, but in the vast stillness of the desert morning, they sounded like a shout. Cole froze. He did not turn to look at her, but she saw the tension lock his shoulders. For a long, breathless moment, he remained perfectly still, his back to her. Then, without any acknowledgement, he turned and walked away, his pace perhaps a little quicker than usual. The rejection was more profound than any harsh word could have been. He was not just a man of few words. He was a man who refused to allow a connection, even the most basic and courteous one, to take root. He refused to let her see him. She tried to catch his eye as he walked away, but he kept his head angled down, the brim of his hat a shield that kept his face, and his world, entirely his own. The days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Clara's life was one of repetition wake. Collect the provisions, work on the cabin, watch the shadows lengthen, and sleep. The solitude began to work on her, changing her in subtle ways. She grew accustomed to the silence, her own thoughts becoming her only companions. She learned the rhythms of the desert around her cabin the way a lizard would sun itself on the same rock every afternoon, the flight path of a hawk that circled high overhead, the soft, ghostly call of an owl after dark. The landscape, once so intimidating, became familiar. The cacti on the hill were her silent neighbors, their stoic, unchanging forms a source of strange comfort. But the silence also gave her too much time to think, to observe, to wonder. From her doorway, she could sometimes see Cole down in the town, a distant, solitary figure. He never seemed to interact with anyone. He would go to the livery, tend to his horse, and then disappear. He didn't frequent the saloon. He didn't stand and talk on the street. He was an island, as isolated in the midst of the town as she was in her cabin on its edge. His solitude mirrored her own, yet it felt different. Hers was imposed by circumstance. His felt chosen, a deliberate wall he had built around himself. She began to wonder what he was hiding. A man didn't live like that, as a ghost on the fringes of society, without a reason. The scar on his face was a permanent reminder of a violent past. The smell of gunpowder on his coat spoke of a familiarity with death. What had he done? Who was he running from? The questions circled in her mind, unanswerable and obsessive. His silence was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken history. She would watch him from afar, this man who was her savior and her jailer, and see not a person, but a collection of secrets bound in denim and leather. Then, one evening, as she sat watching the sky turn a deep, bruised purple, her suspicion turned inward. The cabin was clean now, the floor swept, the single chair and table scrubbed. A few desert wildflowers she had picked stood in a tin can on the windowsill, a small, defiant splash of color against the gloom. She had created a semblance of order, a fragile pocket of civilization. But the silence remained, and in it, she was forced to confront herself. He was hiding something. Yes, but wasn't she doing the exact same thing she had told him, a single, calculated truth about her body, but had lied about everything else through her omission? She had never answered his question, "Why are you here?" She had fled her past, run to the farthest, most desolate corner of the world she could find, and thrown herself on the mercy of the first man who seemed strong enough to offer protection. She had used his stoicism as a shield. She was living in his cabin, eating his food, drinking his water, and he knew nothing about her, not even her name. A cold realization washed over her. Perhaps the distance between them wasn't entirely his making. Perhaps he kept her at arm's length, refused to meet her eye, because he sensed the untruth in her. A man like him, a man who had survived whatever had carved that scar into his face, would surely know how to recognize a lie, even a silent one. He looked at her and saw not a vulnerable girl, but another person with secrets, another person who knew that in a place like this, trust was a luxury no one could afford. The question echoed in the quiet cabin, no longer directed at him, but at herself. Who was the real mystery here? The silent man with the scarred face and the ghosts in his past, or the girl who had appeared from nowhere with a fabricated plea in her eyes? He was hiding something. Of that, she was certain. But then again, so was she. The weeks had woven a fragile truce between Clara and the silence. It was no longer an adversary, but a constant, neutral companion. She learned to measure her days by the slow march of the sun across the sky and the shifting angles of the shadows thrown by the towering saguaros. Her small cabin, once a symbol of abandonment, had become her fortress. She had patched the holes in the walls with a mixture of mud and dry grass, and the door now swung on a repaired hinge, closing with a satisfying thud that shut out the vast, indifferent world. The routine of Cole's morning provisions had become as predictable and comforting as the sunrise itself, a silent exchange, a life sustained by bread, water, and the unspoken agreement to exist in parallel orbits that never intersected. She had begun to believe she was safe. The fear that had driven her to Dustwater had receded, becoming a dull ache in her memory rather than a sharp, immediate terror. The past was a distant country, and here, on this forgotten hillside, she was a new person, a ghost with no history. It was a hot, still afternoon. The air was thick and heavy, and the only sound was the drowsy buzzing of a fly against the single, precious pane of glass she had salvaged and fitted into the window frame. She was inside, scrubbing the wooden table with a damp rag, her movements slow and rhythmic in the oppressive heat. It was in this moment of profound, ordinary quiet that the first sound of intrusion came. It wasn't the soft, nearly imperceptible tread of Cole's boots. This was a clumsy, erratic noise, the sound of a horse being pushed too hard, its hooves stumbling on the rocky ground, followed by a loud, slurred curse that was ripped away by the wind. Clara froze, the rag still in her hand. Her heart, which had been beating with the slow, steady rhythm of her work, gave a violent lurch and then began to hammer against her ribs. Sound was a language in the desert, and this sound spoke of carelessness, of aggression, of a man who did not belong here. She crept to the wall, pressing her eye to a small crack between the logs. Her view was narrow, but she could see a man on a tired-looking gray horse making his way unsteadily up the path to her cabin. He was heavy-set, with a florid, sunburnt face and a dusty bowler hat perched precariously on his head. His clothes were those of a townsman, not a rancher, but they were rumpled and stained, even from a distance. She could see the sheen of sweat on his brow and the way he swayed in the saddle. He was drunk, very drunk. He pulled the horse to a jarring halt near the porch, nearly tumbling to the ground as he dismounted. He staggered forward, his spurs jingling with a discordant sound. He looked at the cabin with a belligerent confusion, as if surprised to find it there. "Harper," he bellowed, his voice thick and raw. "Cole Harper, I know you're skulking around here somewhere. The boys said you take to the hills like a damned coyote. I got business with you." Clara shrank back from the crack in the wall, her breath catching in her throat. He was looking for Cole. A wave of relief, cold and immediate, washed over her, but it was followed by a fresh spike of fear. What kind of business men like this didn't ride out from town in the heat of the day unless the business was ugly? She remained motionless, making herself as small as possible, praying he would grow tired of shouting at an empty cabin and leave. "Come on out," Harper the man roared again. Taking a swig from a flask he pulled from his coat pocket. "Sheriff wants a word about that little disagreement down at the saloon. Said I should fetch you myself. Said you'd listen to reason from an old acquaintance." He laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. Suddenly, another figure materialized at the edge of the clearing. It was Cole. He hadn't come from the direction of the town, but from the rocks and shadows of the hillside. Appearing so silently, it was as if the land itself had given birth to him. He stood perfectly still, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He was a pillar of quiet menace, a stark contrast to the drunken, blustering man who now turned to face him. "Well, there you are." The drunk man, Silas, sneered. "About time. We need to talk." Cole said nothing. He simply stood his ground, his presence a silent, immovable obstacle. "Don't you go silent on me," Silas warned, pointing a wavering finger. "This ain't one of your card games. This is official business. Now, the sheriff says." He took a stumbling step towards Cole, intending to close the distance, but his path took him past the cabin door. In that moment, he happened to glance towards the cabin's dark interior. Clara, mesmerized by the tense standoff, had remained near the doorway, partially obscured by the shadows, but a sliver of light from the window caught the pale corn silk of her hair. Silas stopped dead. He blinked, his drunken eyes struggling to focus. A look of slow, dawning confusion spread across his features. He squinted, leaning forward, his belligerent purpose forgotten. "Well, I'll be," he whispered, his voice losing its aggressive edge and taking on a tone of greasy discovery. He knew her. She saw it in his eyes, in the way his mouth fell open. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold and numb despite the suffocating heat. The past was no longer a distant country. It was here, standing on her porch, smelling of cheap whiskey and old sweat. Silas's eyes lit up with a greedy, triumphant fire. The confusion was gone, replaced by a vicious certainty. He forgot all about Cole, all about the sheriff. He had stumbled upon a much bigger prize. "That's her!" he screamed, his voice cracking with excitement. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at Clara. "That's the girl from Judge Thornton's place. That's her she stole from the judge." The accusation hung in the air, echoing off the silent, watching cacti. It was a death sentence. Clara's carefully constructed world of silence and solitude shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was no longer the quiet woman in the cabin. She was the thief from Judge Thornton's. In a single, fluid motion, Cole moved. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't speak. He simply stepped sideways, placing his body squarely between Silas and the cabin door. He became a physical barrier, a wall of denim and quiet resolve. His message was unmistakable. Silas, emboldened by his discovery and the liquor, was not intimidated. "Get out of the way. Harper, that girl is wanted. There's a reward. The judge will pay a fortune to get his property back." He tried to push past, but Cole stood firm, blocking his path with an unnerving stillness. Clara's paralysis broke. A primal fear, cold and absolute, surged through her. She scrambled forward, out of the shadows of the cabin and into the harsh light. She didn't think, she just reacted. Her hands shot out and she grabbed the sleeve of Cole's dusty shirt, her fingers digging into the coarse fabric. Her voice was a desperate, ragged whisper. "Please," she begged, looking up at the hard line of his jaw, the only part of him she could see. "Please don't let them take me." It was the first time she had touched him, the first time she had asked him for anything more than silent tolerance. She was clinging to him, her last and only hope. She expected him to shake her off. She expected him to step aside and let Silas claim his prize. She expected him to finally speak. to tell her that his charity had reached its limit. He did none of those things. For a tense second, he remained rigid. The muscles in his back coiled tight beneath her hand. Then, he acted. He still didn't speak. He didn't look at her. His gaze remained locked on Silas, who was now fumbling to draw his own weapon, but with his left hand. Cole reached back, his fingers closing around her upper arm in a firm, non-negotiable grip. He pulled her with him, not towards the confrontation, but backwards, deeper into the cabin. The room that had been her sanctuary was now just a passage. He didn't stop at the table or the cot. He went straight to the back wall, to a section that had always been shrouded in shadow. With a hard shove, he pushed open a small, crudely made door she had never even known was there. It opened onto the steep, rocky slope of the hillside behind the cabin. "Go," he said. The single word was not a suggestion. It was a command, as sharp and hard as the crack of a whip. He pushed her out into the blinding sunlight and followed right behind her, pulling the small door shut. They were exposed, on the open hillside, the cabin now between them and Silas. For a moment, they heard Silas shouting in confusion, followed by the crash of the main door being kicked in. There was no time to think. Cole's hand was still on her arm, propelling her forward. "Up," he grunted, and they began to scramble up the treacherous slope. The ground was loose, covered in shale and sharp rocks that turned under her worn shoes. The spiny arms of the saguaros and the needle-sharp cholla seemed to reach for them, tearing at her dress and scratching at their skin. Clara stumbled, her lungs burning, but Cole's grip was like iron, hauling her upward, forcing her to keep pace with his long, desperate strides. They didn't look back. They could hear Silas crashing around inside the small cabin, cursing in frustration. Any second, he would realize where they had gone. Any second, a gunshot might ring out. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths, the scrape of their boots on the rock, and the frantic, terrified beating of Clara's own heart. They were running, not from a drunken man, but from a past that had finally caught up to the present, and they were running together. The frantic scramble up the hillside was a blur of burning lungs and aching muscles. The desert landscape, which had become a familiar backdrop to Clara's solitary life, transformed into a treacherous enemy. Every rock threatened to turn an ankle. Every thorny bush seemed to claw at their clothes and skin. Cole led the way, his grip on her arm unrelenting, pulling her through the worst of it. He moved with a grim, focused determination, his knowledge of the terrain evident in every step. He navigated the steep inclines and rocky ledges not with haste, but with a relentless, efficient pace that consumed the ground beneath them. They didn't stop until the cabin was a mere speck below, and the sounds of Silas's drunken fury had been swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the hills. Only then did Cole release her, pulling them into the deep shadow of a towering rock formation. Clara collapsed against the cool stone, her chest heaving, her legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. Her dress was torn at the hem, and a long, bloody scratch ran down her forearm from a close encounter with a yucca plant. For several minutes, they simply breathed, the harsh, ragged sound of their own respiration the only noise in the world. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Cole stood a few feet away, his back to her, scanning the landscape below. He was a sentinel, his posture radiating a tense watchfulness. He was looking for any sign of pursuit, for the figure of Silas emerging from the cabin, or for a posse riding up from Dustwater. When he seemed satisfied that they were not being immediately followed, he turned. His gaze was practical, sweeping over her torn dress and the scratch on her arm before moving to the surrounding rocks. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Too exposed." He led her again, but this time the pace was slower, more deliberate. He took them not higher, but along a barely perceptible game trail that wound its way around the side of the hill. The trail led to a narrow fissure in a wall of dark, weathered rock, an opening almost completely concealed by a thicket of hardy desert shrubs. Cole pushed aside the branches, revealing the dark, cool mouth of a shallow cave. It wasn't large, barely more than a deep hollow in the stone, but it was sheltered and hidden from view. The air inside was cool and smelled of dry earth and ancient stone. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Clara could see that the cave was just deep enough for them to sit comfortably, shielded from the elements and from prying eyes. A natural opening high on one side served as a vent, and through it, they had a narrow but clear view of the path leading up from the cabin. It was a perfect, temporary fortress. Cole slid his back down the rough wall of the cave until he was sitting on the dusty floor. He gestured for her to do the same. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the silence of distance and secrets, but the shared quiet of two people who had just run for their lives together. It was a silence born of shared exhaustion and a common enemy. Clara watched him in the dim light. He had a scrape on his cheekbone where a branch had whipped him, and his knuckles were raw. He had placed himself between her and danger. He had not hesitated. He had chosen her. The thought was a small, fragile flame flickering to life in the cold cavern of her fear. After a long moment, Cole reached into a leather pouch at his belt. He pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a loaf of bread, the same dense, dark bread he left for her every morning. It was slightly flattened from their frantic climb. He held it in his calloused hands for a second. Then, with a quiet deliberation that felt immensely significant, he broke it in half. He didn't measure the pieces, but she could see that the half he extended to her was slightly larger than the one he kept for himself. "Eat," he said. It was another command, but this one was gentle. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. This was not the transactional provision left on a porch railing. This was a shared meal, an act of communion. She was so hungry she felt hollow, but she ate slowly, making the small portion last. The bread was dry and coarse, but it tasted like the most exquisite meal of her life. They ate in silence, the simple act of chewing and swallowing a profound affirmation of life in the face of what had just happened. When they were finished, Clara found herself wrestling with an unfamiliar conflict. Every instinct for self-preservation, honed over years of hardship and mistrust, told her to keep her distance. She sat with her back pressed against the opposite wall of the small cave, maintaining a conscious physical space between them. To get closer felt like a surrender, an admission of a dependency that terrified her. And yet, for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt genuinely safe. The solid presence of the man across from her was more reassuring than any locked door or high wall. The cool, silent stone at her back and his quiet, watchful presence before her created a pocket of security in a world that had always been fraught with peril. He was a dangerous man. She knew that in her bones. But his danger, she was beginning to understand, was not directed at her. The afternoon wore on. The sliver of sky visible through the opening in the rock faded from a harsh, brilliant blue to a softer, warmer gold. The silence in the cave deepened, becoming comfortable, contemplative. The questions that had plagued her about him seemed, for the moment, less important than the simple, undeniable fact of his protection. He had answered the question of his allegiance with action, not words. Now, she felt a powerful, compelling need to offer him the same. The secret of her past was a heavy, toxic thing inside her, and she could no longer bear its weight alone. She owed him the truth that his earlier question had demanded. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear, stripped of the fear and desperation it had held before. "Aren't you curious about who I really am?" She watched his face in the gathering gloom. He did not seem surprised by the question. He stopped tracing a pattern in the dust on the floor and slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers across the small space. His gaze was as direct and unwavering as it had been on that first night by the fire, but the cold, analytical edge was gone. It had been replaced by something else, something softer and more thoughtful. He considered her question for a long time, so long that she began to think he would not answer at all. She had steeled herself to tell him everything about Judge Thornton, about the stolen goods, about the life she had fled. She was ready to lay the ugly truth at his feet, to let him see the thief Silas had accused her of being. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble in the quiet of the cave, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. "I only care about who you're going to be tomorrow." The words were simple, unadorned, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was not the answer she had expected. He wasn't dismissing her or her past. He was doing something far more radical. He was erasing it. With that single sentence, he severed the chains that bound her to the person she had been. He was not interested in her sins or her mistakes. He was not her confessor or her judge. He was offering her a clean slate, a future untethered from the past that had chased her all the way to this God-forsaken town. He was telling her that her identity was not fixed by what she had done, but was a thing she could still create. Tomorrow. It was a word of immense, breathtaking hope. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped her eye and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow or fear, but of profound, overwhelming relief. The heavy weight she had carried for so long, the secret that had defined and constricted her, simply dissolved in the warmth of his words. She said nothing in return. There was nothing to say. He had given her a gift beyond measure, the gift of a future. As dusk settled over the desert, painting the landscape in shades of purple and deep indigo, they sat together in the sanctuary of the cave. The space between them no longer felt like a chasm of fear and uncertainty. It was just a space, and for the first time, it felt like it could be crossed. His words in the cave had not just offered Clara a future, they had laid the foundation for a new world. They did not return to the compromised cabin on the Cactus Hill. In the deep blue of the pre-dawn twilight the following day, Cole led her away, deeper into the rugged, trackless wilderness that surrounded Dustwater. Their journey was not one of frantic escape, but of deliberate purpose. He moved through the landscape with the quiet confidence of a man who was not merely passing through it, but was a part of it. He led her to a place the world had forgotten, a small, hidden valley, cradled between two high, rocky mesas, accessible only by a narrow, winding canyon. A clear stream, a miracle in this arid land, ran through the center of the valley, lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves rustled with a sound like gentle rain. In the middle of this small, secret paradise stood the bones of an old homestead. It was little more than a one-room sod house, its roof mostly gone, its walls slowly being reclaimed by the earth. But it had a solid stone hearth, a defensible position, and most importantly, it had water. It was a place where life, with enough work, was possible. This was their tomorrow. The days that followed were filled with the kind of labor that leaves no room for thought, only for the task at hand. While Cole worked on repairing the soddy, weaving a new roof from willow branches and mud, Clara took possession of the domestic sphere. Her life, which had once been defined by fear and flight, was now grounded in the fundamental, rhythmic acts of creation and purification. Their new life began not with words, but with the work of their hands. She learned the alchemy of the stream. The water ran cold and clear over smooth, multicolored stones. Here, she learned to wash their few clothes. There was no soap, so Cole showed her how to leach lye from the ashes of their nightly campfire. The process was long and methodical. She would gather the fine, gray ash, mix it with water, and let it steep until the liquid was slick and potent between her fingers. Then she would carry the clothes to the stream, kneeling on a flat rock at the water's edge. The rhythmic scrape and scrub of fabric against stone became a kind of meditation as she worked the harsh lye into the cloth, watching the dirt and grime cloud the clear water around her. She felt as though she were scrubbing away more than just the dust of the trail. She was washing away the memory of fine linens in a judge's house, the grime of the freight car, the stain of her own fear. When she spread the clean, damp clothes on the sun-warmed rocks to dry, they smelled of nothing but sunlight and clean water. It was the scent of a new beginning. Cooking became another ritual. Their diet was simple, dictated by what Cole could hunt or gather. He would return from the wilderness with a rabbit or a brace of quail, and she learned to dress them. Her initial squeamishness giving way to a practical acceptance. Their staple was cornmeal, which Cole had salvaged in a sack from his own supplies. Clara learned to grind the hard kernels between two stones, the coarse, yellow flour dusting her hands and arms. She learned to mix it with water from the stream and a pinch of salt to make a thick mush, which she would cook in a small iron pot over the fire. In the evenings, she would bake ash cakes, patting the dough into small, flat rounds and burying them in the hot embers at the edge of the fire. The first few were burnt offerings, black on the outside and raw within. But she learned to judge the heat of the fire, to feel the dough, to listen to the soft sizzle that told her the cakes were ready. To pull a perfectly cooked, steaming piece of bread from the ashes felt like a small, profound victory. It was nourishment, created from the simplest of elements, fire, water, and grain. It was an act of hope. Cole remained a man of few words, but the quality of his silence had changed. It was no longer a wall between them, but a space they comfortably shared. He would work all day, his movements economical and precise, and she would work alongside him, their separate tasks weaving together to create the fabric of their shared life. He never praised her cooking or complimented her mending, but he ate every last bite of the food she prepared, and he wore the shirts she patched without comment. His acceptance was his applause. Then, about a week into their new life, a new ritual began. One evening, as the sun set behind the western mesa, casting long, cool shadows across their small valley, Clara was banking the fire for the night. She was tired, her muscles aching from a day spent hauling rocks to reinforce the wall of the sadi. Cole, who had been sitting quietly, carving a piece of wood, rose and went to the fire. He poured water into the small iron pot and added a handful of dried leaves from a pouch at his belt. He let it steep over the low heat until a fragrant, minty steam began to rise. He poured the brew into 2 tin cups. He walked over to where she sat and handed one to her. Clara took it, her hands wrapping around the welcome warmth of the metal. She looked at him, surprised. It was the first time he had ever made something for her. His morning provisions had been an act of duty. This felt like an act of care. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of the fire, was calm. The harsh lines seemed softer, and the scar on his chin was just a part of the landscape of his face. He didn't smile, but the look in his eyes was gentle. "Yarrow," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Good for when you're tired." He sat down again, not far from her, and they drank the tea in silence. The brew was warm and slightly bitter, but it soothed the ache in her body and quieted the lingering anxieties in her mind. From that night on, the evening tea became their sacrament. It was a moment to mark the end of the day's labor, a quiet, shared respite as darkness fell. It was an acknowledgement of their partnership, a gesture that said, "We survived another day, together." Their love for she was beginning to understand that this quiet, steady feeling could be nothing else, was not in grand declarations, but in the 1,000 tiny, unspoken actions that defined their days. It was in the way he would leave a pile of perfectly sized kindling by the hearth for her before he left to hunt in the morning. It was in the way she would save the best pieces of meat from the stew for him, making sure his plate was full. It was in the way he once returned, not with game, but with a handful of wild plums, their skins a dusty, deep purple, and laid them on the table for her without a word. She had eaten one, and its sweet, wild flavor was a burst of unexpected joy. Love was in the way they learned to move around each other in the small confines of the sod house, a silent, unconscious choreography. She would know, just by the set of his shoulders. When he was weary, he would know, just by the tone of her humming as she worked, if she was content. When a cold wind blew down from the mesas at night, he would rise from his bedroll by the fire and quietly add another log, his eyes briefly checking to see if the blanket had slipped from her own small cot. They never spoke of the future, and they never spoke of the past. Judge Thornton and Silas and the girl she used to be belonged to another lifetime, another world. Here, in this hidden valley, there was only the sun, the stream, the fire, and the steady, quiet presence of each other. Their life was stripped down to its barest essentials, and in that simplicity, she found a richness she had never known. One evening, as they sat with their customary cups of tea, watching the first stars appear in the vast velvet sky, a thought came to her, clear and certain. They had not spoken a single word of love. They had not exchanged a single promise. But every sunrise, every shared meal, every silent, comfortable moment by the fire was a question, and every small act of care was the answer. The idyllic rhythm of their life in the hidden valley was a quiet, healing balm. The passing of time was no longer something to be feared or outrun, but a gentle, predictable cycle measured in sunrises and the slow wheeling of the stars. The sod house, once a ruin, was now a home. Cole had fashioned a proper door from salvaged planks, and Clara had woven a rug from dried grasses for the floor. They had even built a small, three-sided shelter for Cole's horse, a lean-to of cottonwood poles and a thatched roof that stood a short distance from the house. This small homestead, wrested from the wilderness, was their entire world, a fortress of tranquility against the ghosts that haunted them both. Clara, in particular, threw herself into the creation of this new life with a fierce, almost desperate energy. She worked from the first light of dawn until the last vestiges of twilight faded from the sky. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and capable. She learned to read the clouds for the promise of rain, to identify the edible roots that grew by the stream, to mend Cole's worn denim with stitches that were small and strong. Every task, no matter how menial, was an act of defiance against the person she had been. The girl who had arrived in Dustwater, fragile and terrified, was being systematically erased, replaced by this competent, sun-browned woman of the valley. Her labor was a prayer, a constant, physical effort to prove her worth, not just to Cole, but to herself. She was earning her tomorrow, one grueling day at a time. Cole watched her, his silent gaze missing nothing. He saw the frantic energy that sometimes overtook her, the way she would scrub a pot with a fury that went far beyond the needs of cleanliness, or haul rocks for the garden with a determination that ignored her own physical limits. He never told her to slow down. He understood, in his own taciturn way, that this work was her anchor. But sometimes, when she wasn't looking, a flicker of concern would cross his face, a slight tightening of the lines around his eyes. He saw the fragility beneath the strength, the shadow that no amount of sunlight could quite banish. The storm broke on a day of suffocating heat. A high white sun beat down on the valley, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the very air they breathed. Clara had decided to clear a new patch of ground near the horse shelter, intending to expand their small garden. The earth was hard and unforgiving, packed solid and studded with rocks. She worked with a pickaxe Cole had fashioned from a sharpened piece of iron and a sturdy branch, swinging it with a rhythm that was both punishing and hypnotic. Sweat poured from her, soaking her simple dress and plastering strands of hair to her temples. The repetitive motion, the jarring impact of metal on stone, became the entire focus of her world. She was not just breaking ground. She was breaking the past, shattering the memories with every blow. She ignored the dizziness that began to creep at the edges of her vision, the slight tremor in her hands. She pushed through the growing ache in her back and shoulders. To stop felt like surrender. She lifted the heavy pickaxe for another swing, but this time, the world tilted violently. The brilliant white sun dissolved into a swirling vortex of blackness. The ground seemed to rush up to meet her, and the last thing she heard was the soft thud of her own body falling into the dust. Cole found her a short time later. He had been checking a line of snares he'd set in the high rocks and was returning to the homestead. He saw the pickaxe lying on the ground first, then the still, small form beside it. A cold, unfamiliar feeling, something that felt dangerously like fear, gripped him. He was at her side in an instant, his long strides eating up the distance. He knelt, his movements swift and sure, turning her gently onto her back. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow but steady. A simple faint, brought on by the heat and overexertion. Relief warred with a simmering anger at her carelessness. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her shoulders, lifting her as easily as if she were a child. It was then that he saw it. As he lifted her, the back of her simple cotton dress, damp with sweat, pulled taut across her shoulders, and there, against the pale skin of her lower back, just above her waistline, was a bruise. It was an old injury, long past the initial stages of angry purple and black. It had faded into a sickening, mottled constellation of yellow, green, and a faint, residual violet at the edges. It was the size of a man's fist. It was not the kind of mark left by an accidental fall. It was the clear, unambiguous signature of a deliberate, violent blow. The sight of it made something cold and hard clench in his gut. It was a piece of her hidden history, a brutal truth suddenly laid bare in the unforgiving sunlight. He carried her inside the cool, dark soddy and laid her gently on her cot. He brought a damp cloth and wiped her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. She began to stir, a low moan escaping her lips as consciousness returned. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with a hazy confusion that quickly sharpened into alarm as she realized where she was, and that he was leaning over her. "You fainted," he said, his voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil the sight of the bruise had ignited within him. He straightened up, moving to the other side of the small room, giving her space. Clara sat up slowly, her head pounding. She felt a wave of shame wash over her. To be so weak, to collapse like a fragile town girl after all her hard work. She started to stammer an apology. "I'm sorry, the sun." "It's not the sun," he cut in, his voice quiet but unyielding. He did not look at her, but she could feel the weight of his attention. He was staring at the wall, but his focus was entirely on her. "I saw the mark on your back." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy as stones. The blood drained from Clara's face. The bruise. He had seen it. The one piece of physical evidence she carried from her old life. A secret she had thought was safely hidden beneath her clothes. The shame she had felt moments before was nothing compared to the mortification that now flooded her. The silence in the room became a roaring in her ears. She could feel his unspoken questions, his judgment, his reevaluation of everything he thought he knew about her. The careful, fragile world they had built together suddenly seemed like a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest breath. She could not bear for him to believe she was something she was not, for him to fill in the blanks with his own dark assumptions. The truth, as ugly and dangerous as it was better than the lie of her silence. She took a shaky breath, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. When she spoke, her voice was a monotone, a flat, lifeless recitation of a story she had pushed into the deepest, darkest corner of her mind. "He was a judge, Judge Thornton. He didn't have a wife." She paused, struggling to force the words out. "He liked his housekeepers to be young, unspoiled. He sent a man to the orphanage where I was living. I was bought." The word fell from her lips like a piece of poison. The matron said he paid a good price. She stared at her own hands, unable to look at him. "The judge who bought me said purity made the price higher." The sentence was delivered without inflection, a statement of fact that was more damning than any emotional outcry. He was to finalize the arrangement, to collect me on a Thursday. The bruise, It was from one of the older girls, a friend. She tried to stop them from locking me in the room to wait for him. She fought for me. She finally risked a glance at him. He hadn't moved. His face was a mask of stone, his expression utterly unreadable. His stillness was terrifying. She had to finish. She had to tell him all of it. "I ran," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I ran the night before." The confession was complete. She had laid her shame and her history bare. She was not the innocent she had pretended to be on the train, but a piece of property, damaged goods who had run from a contract. She waited for his verdict, for the disgust, for the pity, for him to tell her to leave. Cole remained silent for a long, unbearable minute. The only sound was the buzzing of the fly against the window pane. He was looking at her now, his gaze intense, penetrating, as if he were seeing her for the very first time. He was not looking at the girl he had protected or the woman he had built a home with. He was looking at a stranger, a survivor with a past far darker than he had imagined. Finally, he pushed himself to his feet. He did not come towards her. He did not offer a word of comfort. He walked to the doorway of the soddy and stood there, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the bright, indifferent glare of the afternoon. The hope that had flickered within her died, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. When he spoke, his voice was not angry, nor was it gentle. It was measured, precise, and held a new, profound distance. "You are still the person I chose to protect," he said, his words clear and final. Nothing more, nothing less. With that, he stepped out of the doorway and was gone, leaving her alone in the sudden, crushing silence of the home they had built together. He had not abandoned her, but he had redefined their world. He had drawn a line, not in the sand, but through the very heart of the life they had shared. He was her protector, but he was not her partner. He had made his choice, and she was, once again, utterly alone. The silence that fell between them after her confession was a different entity from the one they had known before. The earlier silence had been a space of quiet contemplation, a comfortable void they filled with shared work and mutual understanding. This new silence was a presence, a cold, heavy thing that settled in the corners of the sod house and sat between them at the fire. Cole's words, nothing more, nothing less, had drawn a boundary, and they now lived on opposite sides of it. He still protected her. He still provided for her. The routines of their life continued, but they were now a hollow imitation of what they had been. He would leave the hunted game on the porch instead of bringing it inside. The evening ritual of sharing tea was abandoned. He took his cup and sat by the horse shelter, a solitary figure watching the darkness, while she sat alone by the hearth. He had not cast her out, but he had walled her off. He was her guardian, her protector, but the man who had offered her a tomorrow had vanished, replaced by this grim, dutiful stranger. The quiet valley, once a sanctuary of healing, had become a prison of unspoken regret. Clara felt the change as a physical ache, a constant, low-grade sorrow. She had been given a future, only to have the hope of it snatched away. The storm arrived 3 days later, under a sky the color of lead. The air was unnaturally still, the leaves of the cottonwoods hanging limp in the breathless heat. A storm was coming, but it was not one of rain and thunder. Cole felt it first. He was sharpening an axe on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Suddenly, he froze, his head lifting, his eyes fixed on the narrow mouth of the canyon that served as the only entrance to their valley. He was as still as a predator that has caught a foreign scent on the wind. Clara, who was mending a shirt by the doorway, saw the change in him. The quiet watchfulness he always possessed had sharpened into a lethal, focused intensity. "Inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now, bar the door." Before she could question him, he was moving, a blur of silent, purposeful action. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall and his gun belt from the table. He moved not with panic, but with the chilling efficiency of a man for whom this kind of crisis was a familiar, if unwelcome, visitor. Clara scrambled inside, her heart pounding. She slid the heavy wooden bar he had built across the door, her hands trembling, peeking through a small crack in the wall. She heard it, the sound he had detected moments before her. It was the jingle of harnesses and the steady, rhythmic plod of several horses, moving with a confidence that spoke of men who were not lost, but had arrived at their destination. 4 riders emerged from the canyon, fanning out as they entered the valley clearing. They were not drunken drifters like Silas. These men were hard-faced and armed for a fight, their rifles held ready in saddle scabbards. The man in the lead was tall and thin, with a cold, clean-shaven face and pale, watchful eyes. He reined in his horse 100 feet from the soddy, his gaze taking in the house, the horse shelter, and the surrounding rocks with a professional, assessing air. "Cole Harper," the man called out, his voice clear and sharp, with no room for negotiation. "I am Marcus Boone, acting under the authority of Judge Tiberius Thornton. We have a warrant for the return of a fugitive from his service. A girl. We know she's with you. Send her out. And this can end peacefully." Cole, who had taken up a position behind a formidable outcrop of rock to the side of the house, did not answer. He was a part of the landscape, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Boone waited a moment. "The warrant is for theft," he continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "But the judge is a reasonable man. He's more interested in the return of his property than in a lengthy legal affair. Don't make this difficult. Harper, we are 4 to your 1. Clara pressed her back against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. His property. The words echoed the confession she had made to Cole, the ugly truth now being shouted across her sanctuary. They had found her. The past had not just caught up. It was here to lay its claim. The quiet response from the valley was not a shout, but the sudden eruption of thick, choking smoke. Cole had anticipated this. A small, secondary fire pit, hidden from view and piled with damp leaves and green branches, had been ignited by a stray ember he'd obviously left for this very purpose. A dense, gray-white cloud billowed upwards, carried by the faint breeze directly towards the riders, obscuring their view of the Sadi and Cole's position. Cursing, Boone and his men reined their horses back, their eyes stinging. "Spread out," Boone yelled. "Find him. He can't hide in this valley forever." The men dismounted, rifles in hand, and began to advance cautiously through the swirling smoke. The battle had begun. It was not a battle of loud, heroic charges, but one of tactics and terror. A sharp crack echoed from the rocks as Cole's rifle fired, not at a man, but at the ground just in front of one of the advancing figures, sending dirt and rock chips flying. It was a warning shot, a statement of his deadly accuracy. The men dove for cover. "He's over there," one of them yelled, firing blindly into the rocks. The bullet whined harmlessly off the stone, a full 20 feet from Cole's position. Inside the soddy, Clara was a prisoner of sound. The acrid smell of the smoke seeped through the walls. She heard the crack of Cole's rifle, followed by the louder retorts of the posse's weapons. She heard their shouted commands, their frustrated curses. She felt each gunshot as a physical blow. This was her fault. This violence, this invasion, had been brought down upon him because of her. The man who had vowed only to protect her was now fighting a war on her behalf. A scream of pain from outside made her jump. It was followed by a crash and a string of curses. Cole had threaded a tripwire, a simple vine stretched between 2 rocks on one of the main approaches. One of Boone's men had blundered into it, taking a hard fall. He wasn't seriously hurt, but his rifle had clattered away, and his advance was halted. Cole was fighting a battle of delay and confusion, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to make one man seem like 5. He was a ghost in the rocks, his shots coming from one direction, then another, never giving them a clear target. But Clara knew it was a battle he could not win. They were 4, and they were methodical. They were slowly, surely tightening the net. The fight seemed to stretch for an eternity. The initial barrage of gunfire settled into a tense, sporadic exchange. Clara could hear the men communicating, calling out Cole's suspected position, coordinating their movements to flank him. The inevitable was coming. Then, a new sound, a sharp, percussive thud against the soddy wall. Right next to the crack she was peering through, a bullet. They were getting closer. Cole was being pinned down. Suddenly, the bar on the door rattled. Clara Cole's voice was a harsh whisper from just outside. He had circled back under the cover of his own smoke and their divided attention. "Open it, slowly." Her hands shaking, she lifted the bar. He slipped inside, silent as a shadow, and barred it again behind him. He was breathing hard, a thin line of blood trickling from a graze on his temple. His eyes were flinty, his face a mask of grim focus. "They're trying to flank me," he said, his words clipped. "They'll surround this house in minutes. We have to move. The back way, like before." He reloaded his rifle with swift, practiced movements. Then he looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all emotion. He unbuckled his gun belt and held out the heavy Colt revolver to her. "I need my hands free for the rifle. You take this." Clara stared at the gun as if it were a snake. The weapon that had been a constant, silent presence at his side was now being offered to her. It was heavy, made of dark, oiled steel and worn wood. It smelled of gunpowder and power. I can't," she stammered. "I don't know how." "There's no time to learn," he said, his voice hard. He forced the gun into her hands, closing her trembling fingers around the grip. "If one of them gets to you, you point it at them and you pull this trigger. You pull it until it's empty. Do you understand?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The weight of the gun was immense, a terrible, final responsibility. This was the ultimate consequence of her past. The girl who had scrubbed floors and washed clothes was now holding a tool made for killing. A volley of shots hammered into the front of the soddy, splintering the wooden door. Now Cole hissed. He moved to the small, hidden door at the back of the house, the one that led to the hillside. He unbarred it and peered out. "It's clear for now. Go, stay low, get to the high rocks. I'll hold them off here, then I'll follow." "No," Clara said, the word surprising her with its firmness. "Not without you." A look of cold fury crossed his face. "That's an order. Clara, go!" Before she could argue, a bullet tore through the soddy wall just inches from his head. He grunted, stumbling back, his rifle clattering to the floor. He clutched at his left shoulder, his face pale, a dark stain spreading rapidly through the fabric of his shirt. "He was hit?" The protector was down. In that instant, everything shifted. The fear that had been a cold, paralyzing weight in her stomach transformed into a white-hot, clarifying rage. The image of his blood, of his pained face, burned away every last vestige of the terrified girl she had been. He had been hurt protecting her. He had taken a bullet that was meant for the judge's property. She looked at the heavy gun in her hand. She looked at Cole, struggling to pick up his rifle with his good arm. She looked at the back door, the path of escape, the path of the runner. And she made a choice. She was not that person anymore. Ignoring Cole's pained, furious hiss for her to run, she walked to the main door. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She lifted the heavy bar, with the Colt held tightly in both hands. She opened the door and stepped out into the smoke-filled clearing. The sporadic gunfire sputtered into a stunned silence. Boone and his men, who had been closing in on the soddy, froze in their tracks. They saw her, a slender figure in a simple dress, standing in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She held the revolver in front of her, the barrel shaking slightly, but pointed directly at them. Boone stared, a look of disbelief on his face. "Well, now," he said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his lips. The rabbit comes out of its hole. Clara took another step forward, planting her feet in the dirt. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was clear and strong, and it rang across the silent valley with the force of a bell. I am not running anymore. The world narrowed to the space between Clara and the four men. Her declaration, stark and final, hung in the smoke-filled air. For a moment, no one moved. Marcus Boone stared at her, his cruel smile faltering, replaced by a look of genuine disbelief. The sight of this slip of a girl, armed and defiant, was so unexpected it had momentarily broken his focus. It was an opening. From the doorway behind her, a grunt of pain and effort was followed by the sharp, definitive crack of a rifle. The sound was deafeningly close. Boone's head snapped back, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his forehead. He stood for a frozen, impossible second, his expression one of pure surprise, before collapsing into the dust like a puppet with its strings cut. The remaining three men, their confidence shattered by the sudden death of their leader, panicked. They had come for an easy retrieval, not a protracted, deadly gunfight. One of them fired a wild, unaimed shot that buried itself in the sod wall, then turned and scrambled for his horse. The other two were right behind him. They fled, galloping blindly back down the canyon, leaving their dead leader behind in their haste to escape the Valley of Shadows. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the sound of Clara's own ragged breathing. The heavy revolver suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her hands. She let it fall to her side, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak and trembling. She turned and rushed back inside. Cole had slumped against the wall, his face ashen, his good hand pressed tightly against the wound in his shoulder. Blood, dark and slick, seeped between his fingers. He had used the last of his strength to fire that final, life-saving shot. His eyes were glazed with pain, but they were fixed on her, a question in their depths. "They're gone," she whispered. Her voice choked. She fell to her knees beside him. "They've run." His eyes held hers for a moment longer, a flicker of something she couldn't name relief, pride, perhaps even surprise, before they rolled back in his head and he slumped into unconsciousness. The days that followed were a blur of fear and desperate, ceaseless work. The valley, their sanctuary, became a crucible. There was no one to help, no one to ask for guidance. There was only Clara, the unconscious man who had saved her, and the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Her first task was the most terrifying. She had to tend to the wound. With a knife heated in the fire and whiskey from a small flask in Cole's saddlebag, she cleaned the raw, torn flesh. Her hands shook so violently she had to stop and press them against her face to still them. But she did it. She cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt and packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow leaves. Just as he had once taught her it was good for aches, praying it would be good for this, too. She bound it tightly with strips of cloth torn from her own petticoat. He was consumed by a fever. His skin was fire to the touch, and he would thrash in his delirium, muttering names and places she did not know. In those moments, his carefully constructed walls of silence crumbled, and she caught glimpses of the haunted past he kept so fiercely hidden. Names like Jedediah and places like Willow Creek were spoken in a voice thick with anguish and regret. He would cry out in a language that wasn't English, a string of soft, guttural sounds that felt ancient and full of sorrow. She did not understand the words, but she understood the pain. During those long, terrifying hours, she was his anchor to the living world. She bathed his face with cool water from the stream, forcing sips of a thin, clear broth between his cracked lips. She sat by his side, her hand on his forehead, whispering to him, her voice a low, constant murmur against the ravages of the fever. When he thrashed, she would hold him, her slight weight a surprisingly firm presence, her voice crooning nonsense words, sounds meant to soothe, not to be understood. She became a hunter out of necessity, taking the revolver, his gun. Now her tool, she learned to sit for hours, motionless, waiting for a rabbit to venture close enough. Her first kill left her shaking and nauseous, but she did it, because he needed the strength from the broth. She learned to set the snares he had been tending, her fingers fumbling with the knots at first, then becoming nimble and sure. She was no longer just a keeper of the hearth. She was a protector, a provider, a guardian of the life he had given back to her. And in the long, lonely nights, with only the crackling of the fire and the sound of his labored breathing for company, she began to talk to him. At first, it was just small things, descriptions of her day. The stream is running high today. Cole, I saw a blue heron by the rocks. I think the corn I planted is starting to sprout. But as the days bled into one another, her monologues deepened. In the intimate, fire-lit silence, with his consciousness lost to the fever, she found the courage to speak the truth she had never dared give voice to before. She told him about the orphanage, about the gray, colorless days and the gnawing hunger. She told him about the girl who had taken the beating for her, a fierce, loyal friend named Sarah, whose face she was starting to forget. "She was the only one who ever fought for me," Clara whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears as she gently wiped his brow. "Until you." She confessed her deepest fears, her fear of being worthless, of being nothing more than an object to be bought and sold, a piece of property to be claimed. She told him about her small, secret dreams to have a small patch of ground that was her own, to read a book from cover to cover, to feel the sun on her face without worrying who might be watching her. She laid her soul bare to the silent, unconscious man, offering him the tattered pieces of her life, trusting him with them in a way she had never trusted anyone. The act of speaking was a catharsis, a cleansing of the wounds no one could see. The fever broke on the 5th night. She had dozed off in the chair she'd dragged to his bedside, her head resting on the edge of his cot. She awoke with a start, a sudden change in the quality of the silence. His breathing was different, deeper, calmer, without the shallow, ragged edge of the fever. She reached out and touched his forehead. It was cool. The fire was gone. Tears of pure, exhausted relief streamed down her face. He was going to live. For 2 more days, he slept, a deep, healing sleep. Clara continued her vigil, her hope now a small, steady flame rather than a desperate spark. She would watch the slow rise and fall of his chest, a sight that had become the most beautiful thing in the world to her. It was evening when he finally woke. The light in the sadi was soft and golden, the day's last sunbeams filtering through the open doorway. Clara was sitting by his side, mending his torn shirt, her stitches small and even. She felt, more than saw, the change, a subtle shift in the air. She looked up. His eyes were open. They were clear, the fever haze gone. They were fixed on her. He looked weak, and there was still pain in their depths. But he was present. He was himself. She couldn't speak, her throat tight with 1,000 unformed words. He slowly, with what seemed like a monumental effort, lifted his good hand. He didn't try to sit up. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and laid his hand over hers where it rested on his cot, his fingers gently closing around hers. It was not a passionate grasp. It was a simple, profound touch, an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a silent answer to all the words she had whispered to him in the dark. The wall of nothing more, nothing less had crumbled into dust. Tears welled in her eyes again, blurring his face. She leaned closer, her voice a raw, trembling whisper that held the weight of her entire journey. "I lied," she said, the confession a final, necessary unburdening. "That first day on the train, I wasn't a virgin." She paused, letting the truth settle in the quiet space between them. His eyes never left hers. His grip on her hand did not falter. "But I've never felt safe," she continued, her voice breaking on the last word. "Not once in my whole life. Until you..." Cole's recovery was a slow, quiet dawn. In the days following the gunfight, his strength returned in increments, measured not in hours, but in small, hard-won victories. The first was when he could sit up on his own, his back against the cool sod wall, his face pale but his eyes clear and present. The next was when he could stand, leaning heavily on the table, his legs unsteady but determined. Through it all, Clara was a constant, steady presence. The frantic, terrified nurse of his fevered delirium was gone, replaced by a woman of quiet, unshakable competence. Their roles had been irrevocably reversed. She was now the one who provided, who protected the fragile flame of his life. She would bring him broth, and instead of forcing it between his lips, she would simply hold the bowl, and he would take it, his good hand closing around hers for a moment in a silent acknowledgement of his dependency. There was a new vulnerability in him, a yielding to her care that was more profound than any spoken word. He, who had always been the immutable rock, the solitary provider, had to learn to receive, and in his acceptance, he gave her the one thing she had never had the knowledge that she was essential. The wall that his words had built between them was gone, washed away by the blood he had shed for her and the care she had given him in return. The silence that returned to the valley was the old silence, the comfortable one. But it was deeper now, richer, imbued with the resonance of shared trauma and the quiet certainty of their bond. They were two solitary people who had been forged into a single unit in the crucible of violence. As his shoulder healed and his strength returned, a new rhythm established itself. It was the rhythm of building. They were no longer just surviving in the valley. They were putting down roots, transforming the rough homestead into a home with the slow, deliberate work of their hands. Cole, still unable to do heavy lifting, began with small tasks. He would sit for hours by the door, his injured arm in a sling Clara had fashioned, meticulously carving a new set of bowls and spoons from cottonwood. His hands, which she had only ever known to be capable of handling a gun or an axe, moved with a surprising, gentle artistry. When he was strong enough, he turned his attention to the roof of the soddy. It was their most pressing concern, a temporary shelter that would not survive the coming winter rains. He began the laborious process of strengthening the frame, using an adze to shape and fit new cottonwood poles. Clara worked alongside him, a silent, intuitive partner. She would fetch and carry, handing him the tools he needed before he had to ask, holding the poles steady while he lashed them into place with strips of rawhide. They worked in a seamless, unspoken harmony, their movements a quiet conversation. The rhythmic thud of his hammer became the new heartbeat of the valley, a sound of construction, of permanence, of a future being built. While he secured their shelter, Clara turned her attention to the earth. The small garden patch she had started was now a source of immense pride. Corn grew in sturdy green stalks, and the tenacious vines of squash plants snaked across the tilled soil. But she wanted more than just sustenance. She wanted beauty. One afternoon, she took a small trowel and a sack and walked the length of the valley, following the path of the stream. She carefully dug up the small, hardy wildflowers that grew in sheltered pockets, the pale lavender of the desert verbena, the fiery orange of the globe mallow, the cheerful yellow of the brittlebush. She brought them back to the homestead and, along the rough three-railed fence Cole had built for the horse, she began to plant them. It was a slow, painstaking process. She enriched the hard, alkaline soil with dark, damp earth from the stream bank, and she watered each small plant with a tenderness that was almost prayerful. It was, in its own way, an absurd act planting fragile flowers in a land of rock and thorn. But to her, it was the ultimate act of faith. It was a declaration that this was a place where beauty could be allowed to grow, a place where they would stay long enough to see the flowers bloom. Cole would watch her sometimes from the roof where he worked, his hammering pausing for a moment. He would watch her kneeling in the dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hands gently tamping the soil around a new plant. He never said anything, but a softness would enter his eyes. He was watching a woman who was not just surviving, but was creating, was nurturing life, was turning a patch of desolate ground into a place of belonging. Their days were full of this quiet, shared purpose. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the practical needs of the day, the need for more firewood, the state of the corn, the track of a deer he had seen. They did not need to. Their love was not in words, but in the life they were building together, side by side. It was in the solid roof over their heads. It was in the rows of sprouting corn. It was in the hopeful line of wildflowers by the fence. It was in the evening tea, a ritual they had resumed, sitting together by the fire, their shoulders almost touching, watching the stars ignite in the vast, silent sky. One late afternoon, the work for the day was done, the roof was finished, solid and secure. The last of the wildflowers had been planted, a gentle breeze, carrying the first cool hint of the coming autumn, drifted down from the mesas, rustling the leaves of the cottonwoods. Cole and Clara stood side by side near the fence, looking out over their small kingdom. The sun was low in the sky, bathing the valley in a soft, golden light that made the dust motes dance and turned the leaves of the trees to fire. The land, which had once seemed so harsh and unforgiving, looked peaceful, beautiful, like a promised land. They stood in a comfortable silence, simply watching the day come to a close. The air was filled with the scent of dust, of the minty tea on the fire, and the faint, sweet perfume of the newly planted flowers. After a long moment, Clara reached out and laid her hand on top of his where it rested on the top rail of the fence. Her hand was calloused and stained with earth, but her touch was soft. It was a simple gesture, one of possession, of belonging, of a peace so profound it needed no words. He looked down at her hand, then turned his gaze back to the valley. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, quiet rumble, almost carried away by the breeze. "You could leave," he said, "any time you wanted. The past is dead. No one is looking for you now. You're free." It was the greatest gift he could offer her, the one thing she had never had. He was not just acknowledging her freedom. He was guaranteeing it. He was telling her that she was not his possession, not his ward, not a fugitive he was hiding. She was his partner, and the door to the world was open to her if she chose to walk through it. It was his version of a vow, a promise delivered not with flowery words, but with the stark, simple truth. Clara listened to his words, and a slow, gentle smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She didn't turn to look at him. She kept her gaze on the valley, on the solid little house with the smoke curling from its chimney, on the small patch of earth where her flowers were taking root. She squeezed his hand gently. "I'm already home," she replied. "Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also support us by pressing the hype button